When you do project-based learning in your classes, are you actually doing a project? Are you unintentionally doing an activity, a task, or simply a strategy? Today, we're going to unpack a paper that talks about, well, what does project-based learning actually look like? And I'm going to talk about how we might actually do that in computer science education. The article we're exploring today is called Bringing Curriculum to Life, Enacting Project-Based Learning in Music Programs. This was written by Evan S. Tobias, Mark Rodman Campbell, and Philip Greco. Now, even though this particular article is about music education, we're going to talk about how this relates to computer science education. If you don't know who I am, my name is Jared O'Leary. I've worked with every single grade, kindergarten through doctoral student in a variety of contexts from music education to computer science education. Now here's the abstract from the paper. Quote, at its core, project-based learning is based on the idea that real-life problems capture student interest, provoke critical thinking, and develop skills as they engage in and complete complex undertakings that typically result in a realistic product, event, or presentation to an audience. This article offers a starting point for music teachers who might be interested in using project-based learning as a teaching strategy and also interested in building student competency and bringing to life student engagement in the music curriculum. To help music educators enact project-based learning in their classroom and ensembles, we outline a process for designing and facilitating projects, provide vignettes that situates theory and practice, and discuss projects in relation to curriculum, standards, assessment, and teacher evaluation, end quote. As always, you can find a link to this article in the show notes, as well as many other podcast episodes. This is episode 194. So there's over actually 117 hours, I believe, of podcast episodes that you can explore to learn how to teach computer science in your schools or in your contexts. In the first couple of pages of this article, the authors define what project-based learning is. So here's a quote from page 40. Quote, at its core, project-based learning is built on the idea that real-life problems capture student interest and provoke critical thinking and develop skills as they engage in and complete complex tasks that typically result in a realistic product, event, or representation to an audience. Scholar John W. Thomas describes project-based learning as 1. Central to the curriculum. 2. Organized around driving questions that lead students to encounter central concepts or principles of a discipline. 3. Focus on a constructive investigation that involves inquiry and knowledge building. 4. Student-driven, in that students are responsible for making choices and for designing and managing the work. And 5, authentic, by posing problems that occur in the real world and that people care about, end quote. It's from page 40. And now the rest of the article is going to unpack some of what was stated in that particular quote. Before we dive much deeper into this, I do want to say that there are 3 different vignettes that kind of outline what project-based learning looks like in elementary, middle, and in high school contexts. Again, even though this is describing music education, it's very easy to look at this and go, oh, that's what project-based learning might look like in a computer science class or social studies or whatever. So the authors describe many different theories that kind of like inform the projects that are being discussed in the vignette, as well as kind of like outline what it actually looks like from like a day-to-day standpoint. So I'd highly recommend taking a look at the different vignettes, but I'm not going to describe them in today's podcast episode, because I want to tease you enough to be able to walk away going, oh, that was really interesting. I want to learn more about this article and read it, while still getting some practical tips that you can actually use for your class. In figure 1 on page 43, the authors talk about a continuum for teaching and learning options that relate to projects and project-based learning. This is something I've talked about in other presentations that I've done at different conferences like CSTA and ISTE and whatnot, how there is a continuum of projects and project-based learning, from what I describe as more of a closed version of projects to a more open-ended version of projects. The authors talk about how you might engage in activities, tasks, or strategies that involves like a single focus, an integrated focus, or maybe even a unit. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read some of the examples in that figure. But when it comes to projects, they describe projects as potentially being thematic or blended or open-ended. So an example in computer science education that might relate to like a thematic project could be the theme of like algorithmic bias, and then having a variety of different projects that could be explored on the topic of algorithmic bias. While the authors describe these projects as tending to lean more towards like the close end of the continuum, where students have less choice, it is still possible to have some student choice and creativity within these types of projects. So for example, in an interview with Katie Henry, which is titled Microbit, Rhizomatic Learning, and CS for Healing with Katie Henry, this is from episode number 7, so nearly 200 episodes ago, Katie poses the question, when is blank a problem in your life? And you can use that with standards, with concepts, with practices, with whatever. So for example, you could pose the question, when is algorithmic bias a problem in your life? While providing some guidance on the topic or the theme, students get to kind of choose what direction they head into. And they might head in directions that you might have thought of or planned in advance of the actual project. And in episode number 75, Rhizomatic Learning with Catherine Bornhurst, John Stapleton, and Katie Henry, we kind of talk about what that could look like in a classroom where you take this rhizomatic approach to learning or projects. There's another episode, which is episode 150, which is titled Fostering Intersectional Identities Through Rhizomatic Learning, which talks about what this looks like from more of a curriculum development standpoint or a lesson planning standpoint. So check out those episodes if you're interested in it. Okay, so in computer science education, a close project might be like, I want you to create a game with 2 players and it has at least one variable and it's going to be a basketball game. Okay, that would be more of a closed, different type of project. If you go to the opposite end of the curriculum, you might ask questions like, okay, how could you use variables in your project, or how are variables a problem in your life? And then students would have the option to choose like, okay, I'm going to make a choose your own adventure project that has different variables in the project, or I'm going to use it to simulate an environment and simulate physics, or I'm going to use variables to create like a game or whatever. Now, somewhere in the middle, you could have something that is a little bit more open, but a little bit more guidance in terms of providing some constraints, but not enough to make it so that every single project is then going to look the exact same way. So for example, when I was in high school, I took a C++ class. It was the very first computer science class that I ever took. And we had projects like creating a calculator. Everybody's calculator had the exact same functionality as everybody else's because it was a very closed type of project. It took multiple weeks for us to be able to like add in all the different functions and abilities that the teacher wanted us to have in that particular project, but everybody created the exact same thing. If you move towards the middle, I want you to create a calculator, but you get to choose what types of functions you use. So everybody's going to create some kind of a mathematical computing device, but it's going to have different abilities. So somebody might relate it to like mortgages or to doing measurements on a project or just like general addition, subtraction, etc. There are many different things that calculators could be used for that students could choose along that continuum. And then if you go even further along the continuum to an open-ended, it might not be that everybody's creating a calculator, but people are exploring how to do mathematical equations, formulas, etc. through computer science, but the end result might not look like a calculator. It might look like something else, like physics in a video game or something. So that's kind of the continuum of different projects where you can go from like a fixed, a flexible, or an open, or you might think of it as like closed, flexible, and open. Now, the authors provide a framework for designing and preparing for different projects. So there are 6 different steps that you can go through. So here are the steps. Quote, 1, choosing a worthy topic. 2, finding a real-life context. 3, creating generative questions. 4, developing critical thinking and cultivating dispositions. 5, deciding the scope. And 6, designing the experience. End quote. It's from page 41. And the authors unpack each one of those in the following pages. So let's start off with number 1, which was worthy topics. The topics can originate from teachers, from curricula, from standards, from students, from the community, etc. So it could be like current events that are going on related to computer science. It could be a professional topic that people in the field are discussing, or that is relevant to the community that you work in, or even to the individual students that you work with. So both teachers and students can draw inspiration from like academic works, from newspapers, from blogs, from TikTok, from wherever. And again, going back to the ideas that are discussed in the Rhizomatic podcast episodes that I mentioned, you don't necessarily have to come up with just one topic. I would recommend starting with just one topic if you are new to project-based learning, and then eventually you can get to like choose from these 3 options, and then eventually, hey students, there's 30 of you in this class, let's come up with 30 unique projects that are interesting to each one of you, and then you as the teacher will facilitate 30 projects simultaneously. That's on the far end of the progressive continuum that might take some practice, and that's something that I did in my class. So students had several programming languages they could choose from, and they could work on any project that was of interest to them for any length of time. It could be for a couple of days, or it could literally be for a couple of years on one single project, up to the students. You don't have to start there. You can just start with what's outlined in this article, which is how to create a single project. So the authors mentioned that whatever topic you pick, it should spark some wonderment. It should encourage them to imagine and think about like computer science in new and different ways. It should have long-lasting value, and it should also meet the curriculum requirements if you have to worry about that. And on page 42, the authors mentioned something from a book that I read a while back. So here's a quote from that. So it's talking about how student experiences should, quote, be assessed as to their generativity, the extent to which experiences generate additional experiences by creating a need to know. Vibrancy, the extent to which experiences are both minds-on and hands-on. And residue, the extent to which experiences provide a positive and affirming sense of achievement, end quote. So generativity, generating some kind of a need to know. So this is talked about a lot in scholarship on like video games, and how video games create a need to know, in that in order to progress through an area, through a level, or whatever, you have to learn a specific skill. And so if we take that idea and relate it to education and like computer science education, creating some kind of a topic or coming up with some kind of a topic that makes it so that students need to know a particular thing in order to be able to progress in that project. For example, if you want students to be able to create a game, they're going to need to know player controls. You don't necessarily have to outline that at the beginning, but if it's going to be some kind of an interactive game, then students are in some way going to think about interactivity through some kind of a player control, whether it's point and click or keyboard or mouse or whatever. When it comes to vibrancy, students need to be able to engage in both the minds-on and the hands-on. So it has to have those two paired together. There is a tendency when we're talking about like theoretical applications of computer science or whatever, or maybe even some of the ethical implications of computer science, it's a lot of talking and not necessarily a lot of doing. So we might talk about some of the problems with algorithmic bias, but we're not necessarily trying to rewrite algorithms to fix that bias. Depending on the age group and the topic, you might not have that opportunity to actually have students write their own like deep learning AI system or something like that. That's probably not going to happen, but maybe. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't have to actually like create something from scratch or remix something, etc., in order to have it be hands-on. One of the things you could do, if we go with like the topic of algorithmic bias, is have students try and break it to figure out where is this algorithm working as it is designed and where are the biases coming out of this. So if we look at like facial recognition and whatnot, you could like give different data from different faces and then try and find, okay, where does it actually recognize the correct person? So give a correctly identified face that it recognizes, and where is it actually like not working? So as a lot of scholars talk about, facial recognition technology does not necessarily work well with darker complexion because the data that was provided was with people who had lighter complexion. So it was run off of data set that was a certain type of face or certain color or darkness of the skin. So it doesn't necessarily work well for the skin types that were not used in the original data set. That is a way of engaging in hands-on while also doing the minds-on with like ethical discussions around computer science education. And then with the residue, when students walk away from this, are they going to walk away feeling like they accomplished something? Do they better understand some of the ethical impacts of algorithmic bias and better understand how to address it and to look out for it and go, oh, this is working really well in this context, but it has a clear bias against this other context. That kind of residue can have this like long-lasting impact that ideally we want to have in class. We don't just want something to go in one year and out the other year. I'm thinking of my like social studies curricula in particular when I was a student. Memorize all these dates and facts and names of historical people and then completely forgot about why they went into battle to begin with, and have certainly forgotten all the names and dates and facts, etc. Because those experiences in social studies did not have that residue. Okay, so that was the worthy topics. Now, the next thing that the authors recommend focusing on is a real-life context. Computer science is one of those things that can relate to so many different impacts of teaching, learning, life outside of the classroom, etc. Like if students are using their phones, just like even talking about, okay, well, how is it that you are able to communicate from one phone to another? That's a whole like deep dive that you could go into that is relevant to students. Or it could be, how is it that you are able to watch your favorite live streamer when you go home and you're on your computer? Or how is it that you're able to engage in this online learning platform when we have like a at-home learning day, like a remote learning day? You could talk about packets and packet loss and like how the internet works and all sorts of other interesting things related to networking and computing. You could talk about the algorithms that allow that to happen and different programming languages. Like there's so many different avenues that you could go down that relate to that topic and that are relevant to real life context. Whatever direction you end up going down that aligns with that worthy topic that you chose, you're going to end up finding some different communities of practice, a la Lave and Wenger. The authors mention that this, quote, helps students see themselves as potential participants and contributors to different musical practices, end quote. It's from page 43. So if we, again, take this away from musical practices and think about the computer science practices, if you start having it so that students can think about how they're able to communicate, like with different social media people, if you help students realize how they are able to communicate using different devices, like use that as a topic, that allows them to see how some people are communicating with different media. So in the last few months, as an example, I have switched over 100% into content creation on my own. Before, you had to like go to work at an organization and create some lesson plans that were then distributed through physical copies in like the form of textbooks, etc. And then it's like shifted over into, okay, well now I have these online lessons and whatnot. And now what I'm doing is actually creating content 100% on my own, for my own website, for my own YouTube channel, etc. All this to say that there are many ways that people can participate and contribute within a particular domain. So if you're exploring a worthy topic or whatever, there is so much more availability and access with just like simple devices like a cell phone for people to be able to learn about, share, communicate, etc., and explore these different domains and topics. This is very different than when I was in school. A lot of what I was learning in school was like contained within that classroom. We did not necessarily communicate and collaborate with people outside of that, especially not with experts, unless they were brought in physically in person and we were able to ask some questions for like a day or something like that. Most of what I was learning was confined within that particular classroom and had very little connection outside of that. Nowadays, that is very different. So students are able to see themselves as both participants and contributors within a space. I mean, there are teenagers who are making like atom colliders and whatnot in their garages. Those individuals can certainly communicate with people at like CERN and whatnot to kind of like learn from them and talk about what they are learning from that particular process, etc. It doesn't necessarily need to be something as complicated as that, but it could just be something as simple as like software development. Like students who are creating an app in like a high school web development class or an app class or whatever, they could go into different forums, online spaces, etc., and communicate and collaborate and even contribute to those different spaces, which is why it's important to think of the real-life context. But it's also important to go with the next step, which is on questions. Here's a quote from page 43 that kind of talks about, well, what are generative questions? Quote, "They are questions that are open-ended, not easily solved, and have the capacity to generate multiple pathways for student learning. Generative questions, also called driving or essential questions, encourage students to think deeply, to think across subject matters. They create a need to know and provide a relevant and meaningful context for learning. Consider how students' engagement changes when provided with questions that help them see connections between computer science as a discipline and their own lives. Consider, on the other hand, a question that is primarily factual, such as, who is the original creator of the video game Minecraft? While important for ascertaining a specific response, its capacity to generate sustained inquiry, provoke thought, engender lively discussion, or analyze computer science in time, in place is limited," end quote. Now, I modified that to make it about computer science, but the same idea stands because it was obviously originally talking about music. So the authors recommend like creating 1 or 2 generative questions that can help guide students. These are very broad, open-ended questions. It's not something as closed as like what is a variable, or a little bit more open like when might you use a variable, but kind of like what Katie was talking about in episode 7, like when are variables a problem in your life? They're much broader. There are several different episodes that specifically talk about different questions that you can ask, and some podcast episodes unpack like these different types. So I'll link to those in the show notes at jaredo'leary.com if you want to get some more ideas of like the open, guided, and closed questions that could be used while you're facilitating a class as well as while you are designing a project. Now, the next thing to consider after you've developed some generative questions is to think about the critical thinking and dispositions that students will likely engage with when doing this particular project that you're designing. There are some like considerations that they provide on page 44. I'm going to modify this again slightly to make it about computer science. Quote, "Explore a computer science issue or develop a skill from multiple perspectives. Learn how to ask pertinent questions or make informed decisions. Determine how parts and wholes are related or compare, contrast, and predict. Identify blank spots in their computer science skills or be playful and engage in wonderments. Gather and synthesize relevant information into solutions or articulate findings from research. Combine knowledge and skills across disciplines or play a role in local or global needs," end quote. All of these are potential directions that you could head into with different dispositions or ways of thinking critically about computer science. Many of the podcast episodes have had some examples where people have talked about like different projects that they've worked on that could align with and diverge from these different dispositions and that I have listed right here. The next thing that the authors recommend is to consider the scope. So here's some questions from page 44. Quote, "How ready are the students for project-based learning? How comfortable am I with it? How can I work with the existing school schedule?" End quote. Those are 3 really important things to consider. Like I had students who would come into the classroom and who had been doing project-based learning for a long time. So this was very easy for them to be able to jump into. Other students who were brand new to it needed some more guidance, some more hand-holding because they were unsure what this looked like. They're used to the activities-based or task-based things that they had to do in their other classes. And when they came into here and have this like large project that took several weeks or months to work on, they might be like, I don't know what this is. I haven't experienced this before. Now, to be completely candid, most of my instructional experience was related to activity-based stuff as a student. And so when I started teaching, I was used to that as well. The curriculum that I was mandated to teach in the first district that I was in, everything was just a series of lessons that were designed for a single day. Aside from some kind of a connecting theme for units, like, hey, we're going to do this month on rhythm or this month on folk dancing or whatever, there wasn't really much connection from one lesson to the next. And there certainly wasn't one thing that we focused on over the course of a month or semester. So it wasn't until I did my residency that I really kind of saw what project-based learning looked like because I was a TA for a class with one of the authors on this paper. I learned so much just from watching somebody else facilitate a project, and then I went, oh, this is what learning can look like? It was honestly a profound experience. And so I TA'd that class multiple times so I could see how the professor changed things over time, how we modify for newer, different topics, etc. So when I started doing project-based learning with coding, I had already had a couple of years of experience with this and saw what it could look like, and continue to learn from different people like, well, what is rhizomatic learning? How does that relate to project-based learning? So that leads more into, okay, what if students had 3 projects they could choose from instead of just 1? Or what if it was 30 projects that they could come up with instead of just like picking from 3? It was a very gradual thing for me. I didn't just jump into project-based learning right away. So if you're listening to this and going, I don't know, this sounds intimidating, I totally get that. I was there, which is why it's important to think about how comfortable are you with this? Where along that continuum of openness do you want to head into? Do you want to start with a single project? Or are you okay just jumping in the deep end and going straight rhizomatic learning where there's 30 projects going on simultaneously, potentially with multiple programming languages in your class? There's no right or wrong way of doing it, but if you are brand new to it, I'd probably start off with just a single project that everyone does, with the full understanding that it might not be interesting to everybody in your class, which is again why I eventually led to the interest-based project-based learning through rhizomatic learning. And then the last one is just a very realistic thing in terms of like existing school schedules. Like if you are required by admin to have students turn in a portfolio of completed works, not just in-process works, then this could have a constraint on things in terms of, okay, well, how often do I see students? Is it for a quarter? Is it for a semester? Is it for an entire year? When are those like portfolios due? At the end, somewhere in the middle? Are there progresses that you have to do throughout? Because I didn't have to do that, I just had to assign a grade, and that grade was basically, are you in here working on something? And if you are, cool, you get an A. If you weren't, well then, hey, we got to talk about why you aren't creating something that you're interested in. So because of that, some students would spend a couple days or a couple weeks or a couple months or literally a couple years doing the same project. That allowed for that exploration of interest at a pace that worked well for the students who were in those classes. But you might not have that ability because you have a stricter schedule or different admin or whatever. So considering the scope when you're doing this is an important step to do. And then finally, you get to the very last step that the authors mentioned, which is actually designing the experience. Notice you don't start with a design. You start with all this thinking and then you get to it. When I did curriculum development, by the time I left that organization, I created well over 100 lesson plans for Scratch, Junior Scratch, etc. I created a ton of content and still have a bunch more that I could create based off of an outline where I wrote out like 300 projects. I didn't just start with just like throwing out those ideas and whatnot. I started thinking through so many different things before I actually ever created a single lesson plan. Literally months thinking through, okay, how would this look for like a short-term unit? What would this look long-term over the course of several years, etc.? How could we guide students who are brand new in kindergarten and all the way through like 9 years later when they graduate in 8th grade? What could we do in terms of those experiences? You might not have to do that if you only work with a single grade, etc. So your front loading of this might be easier than what mine was for the curriculum development, but it takes a lot of time. You can't just jump into project-based learning the next day if like you just learned about it today. You actually have to think about it, prepare for it, etc. The actual facilitating process was the easiest thing to do because I was just walking around and answering questions or helping pair students with somebody who had a question and somebody that I know could answer that question, etc. That was super easy to do. So if somebody came into the classroom, they'd be like, wow, Jared, it's like students are really engaged, but Jared's not doing a ton. Just walking around helping students one-on-one. It looks like I'm not doing much, but I did a lot of preparation to get to the point where our students were able to do that. So not only does it take a lot of preparation and whatnot and a lot of thinking to be able to design these projects, but the actual facilitating side of things for myself was like the easiest thing to do. Once students got used to what rhizomatic project-based learning looked like, they thrived in that particular space. It didn't mean that there weren't any challenges trying to set this up, which the authors do talk about on page 44. Like challenges, how do you align this with different standards or different curricula? How do you bridge that gap between like the in-school and at-home experiences that students have? What about like the schedule constraints or lack of devices or high-speed internet or administrators who might not value this approach? All of these are very relevant things to consider. But in my experience, it's well worth trying to figure out and problem solve those different challenges. Here's a quote from page 45. Quote, project-based learning empowers educators to design their own curriculum and even co-generate projects with students in place of implementing pre-existing or corporate-produced curriculum. Educators might also consider the types of pedagogy that are most resonant with project-based learning by embracing student-centeredness and facilitating learning, collaborative interaction, and inquiry to help learners develop disciplinary expertise. This may feel different from instruction strategies that are more teacher-centered and emphasize direct instruction, task completion, and content acquisition, end quote. Now, this is something that we talk about in episode 150, which is fostering intersectional identities through rhizomatic learning. If you are going to take this rhizomatic learning approach, it allows you to design hyper-local and individually relevant projects with and for students, as opposed to taking this curriculum out of the box and saying, here, students in my class, I'm sure this is relevant to you and the people in that rural community several hundred miles away, and in the urban community on the other side of the world, etc., etc. As somebody who has designed curricular resources used by hundreds of thousands of students literally around the world, I know how difficult of a task it is to scale at that level, which is why I constantly encourage teachers, hey, if you're going to use these projects, you need to modify them to make it more relevant to the students you're working with. While I have created a project that I think is interesting to students, and that students have said that it's interesting to them, it might not be relevant to each individual or community or group of people within the classes that you work with. So if you're going to start with some kind of like a boxed curriculum that is project-based, make sure you modify it to make it more relevant and individualized for the students that you work with. In the next section, the authors talk about assessment and teacher evaluation. If you're interested in that, you can check out that particular section of the paper, but I'll link to multiple assessment episodes that specifically talk about different types of assessment that you can use with project-based learning. For example, episode 164, which is titled Assessment Considerations, a Simple Heuristic. Now, I want to end this little discussion on project-based learning with 2 quotes from page 46. Quote, when making pedagogical decisions, we might consider the degree to which the approaches we use 1. Support the flexibility required for independent computing thought and engagement. 2. Promote students' inquiry, curiosity, and investment in their own education. 3. Help students develop understanding and skills in computing. And 4. Afford evidence of students' growth and learning. End quote. Page 46. And again, I modified that quote to make it more about computing, computer science, rather than music. And here are some questions that some educators might consider that kind of close out this article. Quote, where might projects complement or modify current teaching approaches in my classes? What aspects of my curriculum might be addressed through project-based learning? What types of generative questions might my students be interested in and lead in engaging computing projects? Who might I collaborate with to help with designing and facilitating projects? End quote. And again, I modified that to make it about computing rather than music. But speaking of questions, I like to end these Unpacking Scholarship episodes by kind of raise some of the lingering questions and thoughts that I have while reading through this. So the first question that I have is, where along the project continuum do your projects tend to lie? So if you've engaged in project-based learning, are they more of like that fixed or closed project? Are they more flexible? Are they open? Are they thematic? Do you tend to engage with one project at a time? Multiple projects? Or do students get to create their own projects? Why is it that you have leaned more towards one or the other? If you've been engaging with project-based learning for a significant period of time, but you've only engaged in one project at a time, what might it look like if you did 2 or 3 or 5 options that students could pick from? As you go through more years and years of creating different projects, it's going to be easier than having to, very first day, come up with like 3 projects, designing them all at the same time. You could just pull from the prior years and go, here are 3 projects from prior years, pick one of those 3 that look interesting to you. That makes it certainly easier for you to be able to gradually increase the number of projects that students can pick from, while also understanding that might not be ideal for the current students you're working with. While maybe 5 years from now, it's going to look great, you're going to have full interest-driven rhizomatic learning experiences, etc., you'll need to understand that it's going to take some time for you as a facilitator to get to that point where you are comfortable doing that, and for students to even be ready for that. Having designed professional development experiences and whatnot that taught this, you can do that over the course of a year or 2. So this doesn't necessarily need to be a 5-year process, like I mentioned. It could just literally be over the course of a year. For the very first semester, let's start everybody working on the same thing. For the next semester, you have 2 options. For the third semester, you have 4 options. For the fourth semester, maybe you have rhizomatic approach where people are able to kind of pick whatever is interesting to them. And it's very realistic educators to get comfortable with that process over the course of a 1 or 2 year process. The next question that I have is, how do projects afford certain types of engagement while constraining others? Again, thinking back to the question that Katie Henry posed is like, when are variables a problem in your life? That affords more types of engagement than simply asking like, how can you create a game that allows you to keep score or has physics or whatever? Still engages with variables, but it's in a much more narrow or constrained approach than a more open one where it's like, how are variables a problem in your life? Every single project you engage with is going to have some kind of an affordance and some kind of a constraint. That's just something we have to understand and live with. Just like the idea that there's always going to be a null curriculum. You can't teach everything in any kind of narrow topic. And just like you can't experience everything when you are engaging in some kind of a project. While some projects might afford or enable or encourage more options for students to engage with than others, they're still going to be constrained in some way. So it's important to think through that and whether or not you're okay with that, or if you could make some slight modifications to make it so that instead of it being constrained in one area, it's actually an affordance with a simple modification. The next question that I have is, how might project-based learning differ in constructivist versus constructionist pedagogies? So for computer science educators like constructionists like Mitch Resnick, Seymour Papert, Kafai, Pepler, etc., like these are all people who are well known for constructionist approaches. I've unpacked many of their papers, as well as interviewed Mitch Resnick in episode 106, which is titled Lifelong Kindergarten with Mitch Resnick. So if you haven't listened to that, I highly recommend it. But constructionist approaches typically focus on learning through creating something, whether it's like an app or a device or whatever, while constructivist is more social. You're learning through communication, collaboration, etc., not necessarily having to build something. So project-based learning is used in both different types of pedagogical approaches, and how might that work in computer science classes? Like, again, going back to the ethics discussions, maybe you're going to lean more towards constructivist approaches when talking about algorithmic bias, etc., because you're not able to have students construct their own large language model or their own facial recognition technology or whatever. Or maybe you do have some options to actually construct that, or maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's not actually building something from scratch, but is instead just kind of like remixing it or something like that. So considering how might students demonstrate their understanding, explore their own interest, or express themselves outside of just active creation? While I prefer students to engage in hands-on learning is not just limited to the actual physical creation of something or some kind of an app or whatever. It's just a gentle challenge to say constructionism is great, but also constructivism is great in other ways. And the last question that I have that's kind of been lingering on my mind is, how comfortable are you with facilitating multiple projects simultaneously? If you're unsure of your comfort level with that, again, start small. Eventually, over the course of that semester, branch out to students picking from 2 projects. The next semester, maybe try with 3 projects. Then the next year, go with more. This could be in the same language, or it could be, hey, pick from one of these 2 projects in 2 separate languages, etc. My classes had multiple programming languages. It had JavaScript with Khan Academy, it had Ruby with Sonic Pi, it had Scratch, which was block-based, and then it had Swift with Xcode so they could create apps or engage in Swift playgrounds. There was a range of different platforms and languages that students could use to create different things. I didn't start there, especially because I don't have a background in computer science and computer science education. I started with 1 language and 1 platform, and then gradually added more and more each semester that went on. If you want support in figuring out how to facilitate multiple projects simultaneously, multiple languages, etc., check out the Rhizomatic Learning episodes that are linked in the show notes, and then also check out the Affinity Space podcast that I talk about, kind of talks about the characteristics that I use that's like helped me to be able to facilitate these kinds of classes. So this is from episode number 89, which is titled Applications of Affinity Space Characteristics in Computer Science Education. It's based off of a chapter I wrote for music educators, but I talk about how it relates to computer science education. This is the 194th episode of the CSKA podcast. There's a ton of content in these podcast episodes, whether it's these episodes where I unpack scholarship, or some of the newer professional development episodes that I've done, or one of the like 75 plus interviews that I've done with some awesome people in the field. If you enjoyed this content that I create, the only thing that I ask is that you share it with other people. It could be, hey, person, I know you, and I think you'd like this particular episode. Or it could be, hey, everybody on my social media feed, here's something that I think is interesting that I want to share with you. My goal is to create high-quality, free computer science, drumming, and gaming resources for people, which is why I have it all neatly organized on my website. So if any of that resonates with you, just consider sharing with somebody else, as that would mean a lot to me. So thank you. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.